Okay, welcome to Unit 7. In this unit, we're going to be talking about ecosystems. So we've talked about the formation of the Earth. We've talked about the layers of the Earth. We talked about all the stuff inside the Earth. We talked about kind of what happens on the surface to the rocks and the major changes in the tectonic plates. So we're kind of now going to move outward a little bit and talk about some things that happen on the Earth's surface. So today we're talking about ecosystems. So you live in one. There's big ones, small ones. We're going to really break down what happens inside them in this lecture today. So what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is defined as a community of organisms and their abiotic environments. All right, so we're going to talk about what the word abiotic means shortly. So some examples of ecosystems might be something as small as an oak forest, right, or even a tree within that forest, or a coral reef. So the reason it can be so wide-ranging in terms of size is because they have no boundaries. There's no, like, this is an ecosystem, like a tree, an animal, a river. There's no sort of boundary defining it. Things can move freely from one ecosystem to another. So pollen can blow from a forest into a field, soil can wash from a mountain to a lake, and birds can migrate from state to state. So it's just sort of like the boundaries don't exist, so animals, even abiotic features, can move easily from place to place. So what are the components of an ecosystem? So this is sort of what are the parts. If we don't define an ecosystem around like a boundary, we're probably going to define it by what we see in the ecosystem. So in order to survive, ecosystems need certain components, right? We all need these things: energy, mineral nutrients, water, oxygen, and living organisms. Plants and rocks are components of the ecosystem, while most of the energy of an ecosystem comes from the sun. More on that later. If one part of the ecosystem is destroyed or changes, the entire system will be affected. So this is a big idea here. All right, we're going to talk about this when we talk about food chains and food webs a little bit later, right? So if I've got an animal and that animal dies, that is going to have what we call maybe like a domino effect, right, on the other organisms living in that ecosystem. So the two big categories of things in ecosystem break down into these two big buckets: biotic and abiotic factors. So a biotic factor, you hear the word bio there, right? So think of like living things or life, are environmental factors that are associated with or the result of the activities of living organisms, which include plants, animals, dead organisms, and the waste products of organisms. Okay, so poop and all that like. So this is basically organic material, right? So we're thinking about things that were once alive, okay, or are alive. So biotic factors include all plants, all animals, bacteria, these microscopic things as well. So everything that's associated with life. Abiotic factors are environmental factors that are not associated with living organisms, including air, water, rocks, and temperature. Okay, so that would be energy in the air. So these are non-living things, right? So non-living things, right? And things that are not associated with life, right? Now you could say, well, poop's not a living thing, but it was created by a living thing. So that's the difference, right? Scientists can organize these living and non-living things into various levels, which of course we'll talk about. So again, here we go. You can see here, this is the organization of ecosystems sort of in a nutshell. We'll break it down from here. But we'll start at the biggest level. So the biggest level would be this biosphere, right? So this includes all ecosystems in a large area or planet, okay? So from there, we go to ecosystem as the next largest. So we're getting smaller as we go down. So an ecosystem includes, remember, abiotic and biotic, okay? So we're talking about abiotic factors plus the biotic factors. So look at this picture here and see if you can discern the abiotic from the biotic factors. Okay, the biotic factors. Look at the picture. All right. If you said, oh well, the lion, the tree, the elephant, the rhino, the crocodile, the termites in this thing here, the grass, those would be your biotic factors. Abiotic are those non-living factors, right? So I'll switch my pen color here to I don't know, black maybe. And so we're talking about the water, this anthill chimney, I suppose, some of the soil, some parts of the soil, some parts are certainly biotic. The air, okay. Those would be your abiotic factors. All right, so then we go down from an ecosystem. The next lower level of organization is the community, then the population of animals, and then the single organism. So to go in reverse, if we start with this wildebeest, that's a single organism. A bunch of wildebeests makes up a population. The wildebeests population mixed in with other animals. Notice how now we've got the wildebeests, plus you've got a rhino, a lion, a giraffe, an elephant, and the vulture. Different populations of animals make up a community, and then you combine those with the abiotic factors. Now we've got an ecosystem. All the ecosystems in the world make up the biosphere. Okay, we're going to start with the most basic organization of abiotic features in an ecosystem, the organism. They're living things that can carry out life processes independently. You are an organism. And so is an ant, a plant, and any bacteria in your intestines or on your hands or on your face. Every organism is a member of a species. Okay, so we'll talk more about these soon, but a species is a group of organisms that are closely related and that can mate to produce fertile offspring. Okay, so your mom and dad are members of the same species, mated and made you. So we would say that, let's say, a dog and a cat, not the same species. If they mated, and that could happen, but if they mated, they would not produce an offspring. So that is proof that they are not of the same species. A population, on the other hand, is a member of the species that may not live in the same place. So if we describe all field mice in Maine, they would not interact with field mice in Texas. However, they are part of the same population of field mice in America. Populations are groups of organisms of the same species that live in a specific geographical area and interbreed. For example, all the field mice in a cornfield make up all the population of field mice. An important characteristic of a population is that the members usually breed with one another rather than members of other populations. So those Maine and Texas mice, are not going to really get together, but they could. For example, bison usually mate with one another, members of the same herd, as wildflowers will usually be pollinated by other flowers in the same field. So population are where we have many examples of the same species. Okay, so my neighborhood has a population of squirrels. My neighborhood has a population of blue jays. My neighborhood has a population of sparrows. All right, so that would be all the number of them. So if it's 100, if it's 10, if it's 5, if it's 2, we would call that a population. A community, however, a little bit more complex. Notice we're getting more and more complex here. A community are groups of various species that live in the same habitat and interact with each other. So species plural. So now we're talking about more than one species. Every population is part of a community. So back to my neighborhood with the squirrels and blue jays and sparrows, each of those populations put together make up the community. So the most obvious difference between communities are the types of species that they have. Land communities have a few species of plants usually, are dominated by them, and these plants determine what organisms can live in that community. So it's typically, we think about trees often maybe as the most, like the type of tree. The type of tree determines, the animals that can live in it and around it, eat from it, the different types of trees make up a community as well. Okay, so within an ecosystem, so within all the populations in that ecosystem, populations of animals don't stay still and kind of do nothing, right? They eat one another, there's transfers of energy, there's life, there's death. That's how ecosystems work. So now for the next part of this lecture, we're going to talk about how these ecosystems change, how they really work, the day-to-day sort of, in some ways, sad realities of ecosystems. The cute, furry little animals eat each other and die, and their populations change. So that's what this little section's about here. Okay, so we really are concerned with this sort of relationship of energy. If each animal has its a certain number of joules of energy in their body, that energy is going to pass things around. How does it get passed around? Well, animals eat each other. Organisms can be classified by what they eat. All right, so the first type of classification is a type of consumer. So a consumer is anything, as we'll see in a second, that eats to gain energy. Okay, animals need energy to live and do life processes. So there's different types of consumers. So herbivores, you might know, eat producers. Okay, so producers make their own energy. More on that in a minute. Carnivores eat other consumers, so other animals. Omnivores eat both producers and consumers. And decomposers break down organic matter from dead organisms, right? Those are the recyclers, the ones that eat living things and recycle that energy into the ecosystem. Okay, so there's a bit more of a breakdown here of the different kind of roles in an ecosystem, right? If we're thinking about the ecosystem like some kind of play, each organism has a role, right? So a producer makes its own food using photosynthesis. So we're talking about plants, obviously, here. So you can kind of just rename producers plants if that helps your thinking. Grasses, ferns, cactuses, depending on the ecosystem, right? So the type of the climate really drives that. If it's a dry climate, you're going to see a cactus. If it's a wet climate, you're going to see, big leafy trees. A consumer eats other consumers, so huge range of things here, right? So starfish, ants, elephants, trees, humans, we're consumers. And then within the type of consumers, again, here are the different breakdown of them. Of the omnivores, we consider ourselves omnivores. And the decomposers, the two big examples you're going to see of decomposers most places are fungi, mushrooms, and bacteria. Bacteria being, kind of makes your food rot in your refrigerator and turn, yucky, would be bacteria. Okay, so just a good chart to study and to have for your reference. So you've most certainly seen photosynthesis before, but what this really kind of hammers home is that the sun, right, is the driver of energy in just about every ecosystem. So energy from the sun enters the ecosystem, right? It's called radiant energy, or enters by radiation. So the sun rays travel from the sun, they enter the Earth's atmosphere here, and they help plants make sugar molecules. This happens through photosynthesis. I know you've learned this before. It's a process by which plants, algae, and some bacteria use sunlight, CO2 right there, and water right there to produce carbohydrates right here and oxygen. Okay, without photosynthesis, life really wouldn't be possible on Earth. So a pretty important process to know. Okay. Okay, a little more detail now on producers and consumers. So again, a producer is an organism that makes its own food, that makes its own organic molecules from inorganic molecules, right? That would be the sun, energy, and CO2, and water. Producers are also called autotrophs, right? So auto meaning self-feeders, troph meaning energy or food. So autotrophs. Organisms that get their energy by eating other organisms are called consumers. Back to another review of that. Consumers that eat other organisms, we call consumers heterotrophs or other feeders. So some producers get their energy directly from the sun by absorbing it. Okay, so kind of a little bit of repetition here, but again, these are the two biggest roles in an ecosystem, being a producer or a consumer. All right, there's a good exception here to the rule. Remember I said before that the sun is sort of the main source of energy. There is one exception here in the deep ocean. So deep sea communities of worms, clams, crabs, mussels, and barnacles exist in total darkness, right? So it's so deep. So here's the ocean here, and the sun is up here, shining down and everything. But this is so deep down that the sun can't penetrate it. These producers in this environment are bacteria, all right? So they use hydrogen sulfide. So that there's an open vent in the earth here. This hydrogen sulfide leaks out from that vent in the Earth's crust in the lithosphere, and that releases some of that food for the bacteria, and then other organisms eat the bacteria, and then other organisms eat those organisms, and we have a full-blown ecosystem way away from the sun. So for a long time we thought the sun was the most important thing. You couldn't have an ecosystem without the sun, but that's actually not true. The bottom of the ocean is evidence of that. Okay, so when the inevitable happens and one organism eats another organism, we have something called an energy transfer. Okay, so we're having energy go from one animal to another. This transfer of energy can be traced by studying a food chain or a food web and trophic levels. We're going to show you those things now. So here in this basic food chain, which is a sequence in which energy is transferred from one organism to the next as each organism eats another organism. In this food chain, we're starting with algae, and the arrow is pointing to the animal that eats the previous organism. So the algae is in the ocean. A little shrimp-like creature called krill eats the algae. An Antarctic toothfish eats the krill. And then a leopard seal comes along and eats the toothfish, and a killer whale eats the leopard seal. This would be the top consumer here in this food chain, or the tertiary consumer in this food chain here. And you can see energy is starting here because algae is a producer. So just about all food chains and all these systems begin with that producer. They make their own food, and then it's eaten by the other organisms in the ecosystem. A food web is a little more complex. So ecosystems always have more food than just one food chain. A food web shows many feeding relationships that are possible in an ecosystem. So this takes kind of the food chain we saw earlier and kind of, jazzes it up a little bit here. So instead of just having this simple food chain, of course, krill are eaten by other animals too. They don't just have one consumer. Krill are also eaten by the penguin. Krill are also eaten by krill are also eaten by, I guess it's just the penguin as well, excuse me. But then the penguin is food for the seal, not just the toothfish. And you can kind of see all these other, definitely more complex situations here, right? We have more food for the killer whale. The killer whale will feed on the crab eater seal, will feed on the elephant seal, all the seals. As well as some squid, and the killer whale might eat a penguin too. The killer whale is that top dog. It's the predator in this ecosystem that can really not worry about another animal eating it and eat everything. So the difference again between a food web and a food chain is a food web shows the many feeding relationships, not just a more linear or line path. So now we're talking about trophic levels. You heard me mention it before. So each step in the transfer of energy through a food chain or food web is known as a trophic level. Okay, so if we're starting with a little bacteria, a little algae, or something here, and that gets eaten, let's say by the krill. There's my krill drawing. Hope you like it. If that's eaten by the krill, that would be a trophic level. So we've increased by one trophic level there. Okay, a trophic level is one of the steps in a food chain or food pyramid or food web. Examples include producers and primary, secondary, and this idea of tertiary consumers. Those are the top consumers. Okay. Each time energy is transferred, some of that energy is lost in the form of heat. Okay, so when the krill eats the algae, it digests it, right? And some of that burned energy that the krill has taken from the algae is lost in the form of heat. That's true of any energy transfer. That's true of when the krill gets eaten by the seal, okay? And the seal burns some of that krill for food, so a little bit gets lost to heat, right? So we lose a small fraction of that to heat each time an animal eats another animal. Therefore, less energy is available at higher trophic levels. So if we kept on going to the whale here, all that energy that went through these other trophic levels, right, for the second trophic level to the third, there's a little bit of energy that gets lost each time. So the whale has kind of less available to it in the ecosystem than the consumers at the lower trophic levels, okay? And we usually use an energy pyramid to visualize that, so let's take a look at that. So at the energy pyramid, notice you've got some different animals this time. We're talking about some crickets, some birds, and the hawk here would be our tertiary consumer, okay? So in this ecosystem, I want you to really look at here at the lower trophic level, okay? You've got the lowest level, you've got the grass, the producers, right? Notice on the pyramid how it's the largest area. It's the biggest piece of the pyramid, that bottom base, okay? And as you go higher, these little sections get smaller and smaller. And finally, the tertiary consumer's space is the smallest. That is showing you as you go from producer through the consumers, there's less energy available to those top consumers. Because, remember, a little bit of that energy, each time an animal eats another animal, it gets lost to heat, okay? It gets lost in, in the digestive processes and in the burning of that energy for energy to move, energy to hunt, energy to live. A little bit gets lost, okay? So the total amount of energy up here is less than the energy down here. There's a little bit more total energy in the ecosystem at that bottom level. So each layer, again, of the pyramid represents one trophic level. Producers at the base of the energy pyramid, therefore, have the most energy. The pyramid becomes smaller up at the top, where less energy is available. Decreasing the amount of energy at each trophic level affects the organization of an ecosystem, all right? So if there's a change in the population, let's say of those birds, then the hawks have less food to eat, right? So we kind of have it, that's what reduces populations of animals, is when their prey tends to disappear or tends to go down in population. That makes the population of the predator that eats the prey go down as well. So energy loss affects the number of organisms at each level. Energy loss limits the number of trophic levels in an ecosystem. So if there's an ecosystem where a lot of energy gets lost, there won't be very many steps in that pyramid. You may have one producer and one consumer, right? Or one producer and two consumers. It's going to make it a lot more of a simple ecosystem. Okay, so in this lecture, we talked about what an ecosystem is, what a population is, what a community of different species of animals are. We talked about what an organism is. We talked about within that ecosystem how energy gets transferred, right? So in food webs, and food chains, and energy pyramids, and also we talked about the different types of consumers, and hopefully you have an understanding of, a little bit more of an understanding of how this ecosystem is organized, or how any ecosystem might be organized. We're going to go more specific as we go forward this unit and talk about some specific types of ecosystems and get a little bit more granular, but this was a good start, and hope you guys enjoyed it and are ready for a fun little quiz on this topic. Take care, and go Bills.